Hello everyone and welcome to Whisky Wednesday. Now before we even get into it, a lot of you are going to see this bottle, you might be thinking, why is he reviewing that? But there's a decent story behind it, it's quite an interesting story in my eyes, and I've always felt like Canadian whisky in the whole wilderness of the whisky industry is something which is a little bit of a lost voice, especially for us in the UK. We don't see a lot of it. What we do see is fairly typical brands, but more are coming in now. This one leading the way. But Lot 40 and some of the Wiser's stock are really taking over and making a very positive impression on people. But as you can see, this is Canadian Club Whisky. This is the base level version that isn't like a pre-mixed drink or a liqueur or anything, just the standard entry point CC bottling. You'd have seen it in Mad Men and numerous other TV shows, as well as every whisky book ever that's ever talked about whisky from Canada. It's very symbolic, it's very important. Its history is pretty important to the grand scheme of everything. Started by Hiram Walker, one of the most legendary people in all of the whiskey making industry. Started off in Detroit, moved his entire operation north to Windsor, Ontario, built a little village outside the distillery to employ everyone and keep everyone there. The name itself is quite important, Club. The style became very popular during sort of like the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. In gentlemen's clubs, they were drinking this as cocktails, as highballs, neat ice, whatever might have you. And it became such a popular style that American distillers and even some Scottish blenders who were also producing a club style whiskey argued that it should have Canadian on the front of it to make it different, which they thought would encourage sales of their own brands. They got it wrong. And people loved Walker's recipe so much that including Canadian on it just made it a point of interest for more people, and more people wanted to try it and understand why Canadian whiskey was different from American. And I imagine even back in the day, it was relatively affordable. Canadian whiskey for me kind of gained its own infamy and fame, both at the same time during Prohibition. Al Capone used to run this stuff, specifically this stuff, from Ontario into Detroit and then distribute it throughout all of the US to people like George Remus and many of the charismatic characters of the time. There are a couple of different versions of Canadian Club. I've had the privilege of trying a large amount of them in Canada last year, even the 41-year-old, which was quite an incredible thing. I think it was the oldest Canadian whiskey at the time, and they've got a 42 and I think a 43-year-old now. But an unusual element of Canadian whiskey for me is that this is a blended whiskey, so it's malted grain. We assume that grain will be rye. Rye grows very well in Canada, as all of you Canadians watching this will know. But within Canadian whiskey making law, there's a very unusual law, which I think was introduced to make sending whiskey to America like lower tax rates. And in all Canadian whiskey, you can add 0.09% of something that isn't whiskey to the product. So if you want to make a sherry flavored or a sherry influenced product, you can add less than 1% sherry to it, or cognac or rum. Quite an unusual law, nothing that really takes place elsewhere in the whiskey industry. It's quite archaic. I hope Canadian whiskey gets rid of that law and more of it comes to the UK in its fashion, because Lot 40 impressed me, Wiser's impressed me. And in general, this has impressed me, especially for the price. This shifts just under 2 million cases per year, which might not sound a lot in comparison to Johnny Walker or Jameson's, these monoliths and these colossus of blended whiskies. But 2 million cases is still quite a lot. It's currently owned by Beam Suntory, and it's distilled, matured in Canada, and sent over to nearly the other side of the world for sub £20 a bottle in the UK, which I can't really argue with. I think that's quite good value. But we'll taste it, we'll smell it, we'll walk through it and just see why Canadian whiskey might be a little bit different. Quite a Christmassy nose. There's like orange and cinnamon. A lot of people use this whiskey to make highballs with because it is a very scented floral product. You really get the malted elements. You can kind of get that creamy malted barley, the rye spice. It's green, it's earthy. You get that slightly, just kind of, big, bold hit of spice with it, even when you're just smelling it. Yeah, orange and sherry and Christmas cake and kind of marinated fruits. It's got a deeper nose to it than you would imagine. It's about 6 to 8 years old. There will be some older stuff in there. We don't really know what the extent of that is. The 12-year-old does come in a slightly different bottle. It's more of like a decanter bottle, and there's numerous different bottle shapes for their entire range, but this is kind of the classic. But beautiful nose, pretty welcoming. You do get a little bit of that young grain, that kind of green earthy spiciness, almost like agave sweetness to it. But we'll taste it, and that's where the money is, right? It's initially quite peppery. It's got like a nice bit of white pepper. Really kind of crowds the front of your tongue. There's not much going on at the back. That is no doubt the rye. I've drank enough rye whiskey to notice when that can kind of kick in a very specific way. The large amount of barley element to it is pretty light. It's very clean. Not a whiskey that's going to blow you away, but I think for the price point, it's not designed to do that. It's just designed to be affordable, of legal spirit limit of 40%, and just, you know, a pretty easy drinker, which is what it's doing so far with a nice bit of spice. It's silky, it's soft. There's a very, very slight astringency to it. We always talk about young grain whiskies and that kind of slight plasticky note they can have. There's a tiny bit of that, but most of it is dominated with this really nice orange, pithy, bittersweet, cinnamon, mace spice kind of flavour to it. I don't think it's bad at all for the money. I think it's a very respectable thing. Some of you will be laughing at me now because it's Canadian Club compared to Springbank 21 or the Glendronachs that we've reviewed and Yamazaki 12 and all this kind of stuff. But for sub £20 a bottle, I've really kind of fallen back in love with cheaper, affordable blended whiskies, as you'll find out as the next couple of videos come out. And it genuinely does impress me to quite a degree. I'd put it on like a similar level to something like Jameson's in terms of value for money. I'd say in my head it's as famous a brand for numerous different reasons. It doesn't quite score the same. Instead of like getting a 7, it's going to get a 6.5. Please don't judge that in any way as like being harsh. But this is something I will add to my own sort of home whiskey cabinet for just cheap, affordable, late night with a book kind of thing, instead of drinking, you know, bourbons that are impossible to get hold of after the bottle's gone. So a little bit of a fodder product, I suppose you could say, but I don't think it's bad at all for the price point. But yeah, Canadian Club, a 6.5 out of 10. Pretty respectable. In no way does that mean it's bad. But in my mind, it gives you a really cool story, a lot of history, and not necessarily bang for your buck, but something which doesn't overinflate itself to be, you know, incredible. It just does what it says on the tin, really, or the bottle, I should say. But thank you all for watching. That's Canadian Club. I'm Phil, and this is Whisky Wednesday, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers.